start off and check in and say a massive welcome to everyone who's joined me today for our webinar on Practice PL in lockdown. It's certainly great to have you on board. I know there are a number of participants sitting in the room at the moment, but also a number of people that will get this link at a later stage. And I guess probably before we do kick off and before we do get too far into talking about some PL opportunities that present at home, I just want to say a massive thank you and acknowledge some of the outstanding things that our teachers have been doing at the moment, and it is such challenging times. And I certainly appreciate the conversations I've been having with a number of teachers, and I know that there'll be people sitting in here today that have made an extra effort to make that time so crucial in today's life really important to put some thought and thinking into a professional learning opportunity. I also think, given the current climate and some of the challenges that we've got, it's also a nice little distraction that we often look for away from coronavirus and towards putting something back into our own professional learning and our own professional development. Look, I guess this for me, it's new space, isn't it, for all of us, that we're doing this online learning. We're working in an environment that we haven't worked with before. And this is going to be a little bit the same. It's not a seamless, pre-planned television show with the full edits. It's fairly natural. And I want you to make sure that you feel that, and at any stage you can get involved and maybe help me along this path that we're trying to lead around upskilling and getting a little bit more insight. So let's kick off, and I want you to know that it's your plane to fly as well. I'm just going to point out a couple of little things about the webinar and how you can use them to your advantage. First of all, you'll find somewhere around your screen there's a chat section. It's easy in a webinar to sit back, to listen and to not engage. And if that's what you need today, given the challenges that you've been facing, then I totally accept that. I'm happy for people just to sit in and just to listen. But there may be a question that you have, there may be a comment that you want to make. If that's the case, what you just need to do is just type that into the chat box. At some stage through the webinar, I'll try and take a little breather, have a look at some of the comments or the questions that we've got there and try and answer them so that everyone's on the same page. Just with that function, it's important to note that there is a little box down the bottom, a drop box, and it's all panelists, and I think the other option is all panelists and everyone. Just make sure that if you want everyone to see that chat or that question, that you pop in the and everyone option as well. At the end of today, I'll also make sure that you get the slide deck sent directly to your email, and we'll make sure that will come probably within about the next 48 hours. So if you're sitting there taking notes, making sure that you're trying to capture everything that's on the screen, I'm just going to say, stop, hold back. You'll get the slide deck in your inbox over the coming days. All right, let's just sort of move into, I guess, where my thinking has been over the last 24 hours. And coming into this webinar, I was super excited to share my love and my passion and the work that I do around restorative practices. But it probably made me stop and think about, getting that balance right. And there's a couple of things that I'm trying to balance out today. And I hope that I do meet that need of what you're looking for. And certainly for me, it's around how do I take you away from the current thinking or the current challenges that we've got going on in our everyday lives? How do we, remove ourselves from that challenge of worrying about home learning or worrying about our students, worrying about the things that are happening right now in the world, and how do we move to a space where we'll actually be able to get something, save that for a later stage when we do return to the classrooms and we do get back to a bit of normality. But I think the other really important thing for me around that balance is that, acknowledging that we've got a number of different people along a different journey in the room today, and we've got some leaders, some teachers. I certainly know that we've got some parents out there as well who have opted to jump in and listen to what this restorative practice stuff is all about. So it's great to have you all on board. But I guess we've also got different levels of understanding when it comes to restorative practices. And I guess from my point of view, trying to meet the needs of everyone is going to be my intention today, but whether I achieve that or not is another story. So if at any stage you feel that you need something a little bit more targeted to you, there'll be an opportunity for you to reach out. I guess the really good thing about today is that when we do stop and we do spend some time thinking about our practice, that's when we often make our best decisions. And I hope that if nothing else, you start to just question, start to think about, what is it that I can get out of today that's going to help me in my classroom over the coming weeks, over the coming years, and maybe as I move myself into 2021 and how I can actually help the work that I'm currently doing. I guess, starting off with that, why not learn about restorative practices? And I guess for people here, it might be just about clarifying what you already know about restorative practice. It might be just that pleasant reminder. But I think the important thing is there'll be people sitting in this room today that'll go, what is this restorative practice stuff that we often talk about? And I think when we talk to school leaders, when we talk to teachers, everyone's got their own filter over restorative practices. And when we talk about what that filter actually looks like, there'll be people that will tell me, yeah, you know what, I know a little bit about restorative practices. I know that it's a thing that you do when the student messes up. It's a way that we ensure that the well-being of all our children are looked after to the best possible way. And you're right, it is a little bit about all of that. But I guess that the other part of that, it's actually about informing our practice and about a way of practicing that's going to help us succeed or give our best possible chance of success in the classroom. So whatever filter you've got over restorative practices, I hope today will be an opportunity for you just to clarify that filter and hopefully find out a little bit more about what's going to serve you. I guess the second part of that is arriving at the decision to sit in and to listen about what restorative practice has got to offer me and how it's actually going to work. I think the most important thing is that at any given time throughout the classroom, due to the emotions that we face, due to the number of challenges that we have, we can go through a whole range of different feelings. If I go back to my time in the classroom, this often represents the feeling that I'd often have is as my students would walk out of the classroom in that feeling of, what just happened then? And you know, that's not a daily thing, but I know that every teacher and every school leader would be challenged at different stages with that feeling. I guess the second thing that I'd often feel is that I'd just be screaming in, what just happened and why is that happening the way that it's unfolding? So these different emotions are the reality of what the classroom presents. When we've got 25 young people walking through our doors and bringing all of the different challenges that they bring in, we certainly can only expect this to be a normal part of our day. But for some people, it might be about that movie of Bill Murray, Groundhog Day, where we go, didn't we go through this yesterday? And this is when we sort of start to talk about those frequent flyers or wondering at times when you sit back and you go, what just happened? Did I actually get through? I think the important thing when we talk about practicing restoratively, and you know, I had to clarify this only last week with a school that I was working with. What I want to sort of make really clear is that it's not just for negative things that may happen in the classroom. It can be really about how do I take the great work that I'm currently doing. I've got this classroom that's super calm. I've got this beautiful group of students, but what I want to do is take them from good to great, or I want to take them from great to even better again. And restorative practices can allow you to do that. So please, not for 1 minute do we need to think that it is a way of mopping up the mess of selfish students or for naughty students or for students that aren't doing the right thing. Yeah, it does help us with that, but it actually helps take those great opportunities that we've got in the classroom and make them even better. So if I guess to sort of further add to that, and again, you know, this is based on the research of what it is that's keeping us awake at night as educators. And I think there are two key things that the research points towards. Number one, it's workload. And number two, it's student behaviour. So let's just unpack that a little bit and work through where restorative practices sits and how that can actually help us along this way. Number one is workload. I guess when I talk to workload, I'm not here today to give you more work. I'm not here to give you another program. So if you're sitting in this webinar thinking, Simon, get through this, at the end, just send me the booklet and I'll be right to go tomorrow, I'm going to have to say right now, you're not in it for the right reasons. We don't have a handbook that's going to give you all of the answers. It's actually a way of practicing. And when we talk about, you know, I guess a metaphor that relates so clearly to my time when I was in the school was around spinning plates. And we often talk about, you know, as schools, what we keep trying to do is spin more plates. And what happens is that when we find a need for improvement across our school, what we often do is we put a program in over the top, or we put an initiative in over the top. But we start to hit a point when we say that's too much, or I'm not getting traction with the work that I'm currently doing. So what we like to do is to underpin this improvement that we're on about and the underpin to make this workload sort of easier. What we do is we focus on our culture. And when I talk about culture, again, I use this gag quite often with our schools. I ask them, right, tell me now, put your hand up if you think that school culture is important. And without fail, every single person would put their hand up. So keep them up. What I want you to do right now is tell me what school culture actually means. And all of a sudden you get this sort of deafening silence across your cohort of staff, and then all of a sudden these hands start dropping and people start making, you know, less eye contact than they possibly were. What it is, it tells us that we're not explicit on school culture, and it's a little bit like that great Australian movie, The Castle, when we hear Dennis Denuto sort of trying to explain the Constitution. He just tells us a little bit about the vibe. And I think that's the reality of what we talk about when we talk about school culture. Now, if we can get the culture right, what we're hoping to do is to improve the effectiveness of the work that we're currently doing. And again, this sits underneath that restorative approach. I guess the second thing that we talk about there in terms of what's keeping us awake at night is undoubtedly it's student behaviour. And there's a number of pieces of research around at the moment that will tell us that this is one of the greatest challenges that teachers are facing. And I think when I talk to teachers about the way that we're handling the behaviours that are being presented in our classrooms, what I'm hearing is that there's generally three different ways that we're sort of handling them. Number one is that, people tell me they're sort of using the carrot, which is extrinsic rewards, pleading with students to do the right thing and saying, if you can behave in this certain way, I will give you this. Now, what we know is that will give us success in the short term, but it's actually not going to give and bring that long-term change and that long-term satisfaction that we want to bring around our calm classrooms. What we know is those extrinsic rewards will wear off pretty quickly. The second thing that we're hearing is around the big stick. If you don't do this, this will happen. And what we're sort of saying here is that we're trying to box up behaviour into a nice, neat little package and say behaviour A equals consequence A. Now, again, what we know is that that's not going to be an effective way of supporting our students for improvements in their behaviour over a long period of time. Yet we might get a short-term gain, but the big stick isn't actually going to help us achieve the results we want to achieve. And the third one that you see there is around relationships. So students behave in a certain way because it's the right thing to do, because they value the relationship and they respect the person or the people that are supporting them and holding them accountable in this. So I think if you go back to your time in the classroom, whether that be today, yesterday, last week, even last year, I think, those three approaches to student management behaviour would be something that would be sort of obvious across your school community. So where do we want to go? What's the work of restorative practices? The work of restorative practices centres around that third box, and the third box is around behaviour and relationships. And I just want to have a quick look at what you see on the slide there. I'm not going to read that to you. While you're doing that, obviously for the importance of the slide, I've highlighted the words that I feel stand to truth in the red. Excuse me, I just had to have a drink there. What we're talking about is healthy relationships and strong school communities. And a restorative approach will help us manage conflict by repairing the harm. We're going to pick up on that word harm a little bit later on, and strengthening relationships. Now, I guess for me, whenever I talk to educators, most people go, yeah, I believe in that. That makes sense. That's true. I do that. I think the reality is that people do make every effort to do it. But this is where we get that word thrown around in schools so often around consistency. If we were consistent in our approaches, if we found a way to be able to do this so we're all on the same page, well, restorative practice is actually the methodology that helps us do this. Restorative practice is the way forward in terms of strengthening those relationships. And if I go back 2 slides, it's the way that we can get those improvements in the culture that we're looking to achieve. I think it's certainly important too that I flag with you around some of the myths, and I think it's open conversation that needs to happen when we talk about how restorative practice can serve us in our school environment. And I go back to that filter that everyone has over a restorative approach to learning and understanding those words. I think there are 2 really clear things that sort of come through in terms of myths that need to be knocked about when we talk restorative approaches. Number one is that it takes too long. Often I hear from educators say, but I can't do that restorative stuff. I haven't got time. And number 2 is that there are no consequences. What I'm going to say now are both of those approaches to using restorative practices need to be thrown out, because really, from my point of view, restorative practices can actually be time well spent in terms of, 1, getting a better outcome, but 2, actually saving you some time. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And number 2 is it can have consequences. It's okay, but it's actually how the consequences are overlaid, put into place, and implemented so that the student understands where they actually sit. I guess probably because of the nature of this type of professional learning, what we've got sitting in the room today would be 2 types of people. I think there'd be people that are already invested. So if you're already invested, you're already practicing, you're trying this stuff, you may believe in it, you may be having some success, you just may need to tidy up some of that understanding. But number 2 is there may be a group of people that are saying, you know what, I'm just interested. I've heard about this stuff and I've got the I wonders. Well, I think it's those I wonders that sort of sit there around when you go back to your school and you start to talk about what it is that restorative practice actually means, that most people will throw these 2 myths at you. So hopefully throughout the next half an hour to 40 minutes, I'll be able to talk you through how we can actually make this work for us and not against us, because I actually do believe that both those myths are quite the opposite. So when we talk restorative practices, the tenets of RP, you take a look at that photo on the side of your screen there, and I think it brings back some memories, and I won't say fond memories, but memories of our time of adults when we were in the school environment. I reckon the really important thing here is that what we have to accept is that most adults understand a system based on their own experience. So from about the age of 4 or 5, we were exposed to school under the ideas of an adversarial model or an adversarial blame approach. And what we've got to accept here is that so were our parents. So when we start to talk to our parents, this is the model that they're familiar with. And when we talk about that adversarial, that blame approach, what we're talking about is anchoring in the past. What happened? Who is to blame? What punishment or sanction is needed? So what we're saying here is, again, if you behave in a certain way, this will result in consequence. And that consequence may be behaviour A equals consequence A. But what we feel is that when we put that consequence into place, that's actually going to deter the behaviour. And again, this is where we've got to sort of talk a little bit about, one, the importance of getting the process right, which I'm going to sort of touch on a little bit later on. But two, that we can't box up behaviours into a nice, neat little package. If I was to sit that alongside a restorative approach, the basic tenets of RP, as you'll see a difference here when we start to get into it, is that the restorative approach looks at what happened, what harm has resulted, and what needs to happen to make things right. So basically what we're saying is we're looking at a process of going past, present, and future. The important thing to note is that we do need to get that snapshot of what happened in the past. You'll see that both models look backwards. But the very clear difference between a restorative and adversarial model is that in that adversarial approach, we are anchored in the past. But when we talk about a restorative approach, we're talking about who's been affected and why. And most importantly, what are we going to do to fix that mess up? Now, if I was to sit both of the models side by side, that adversarial focus in the past, which I've mentioned a couple of times there, preoccupied with blame. Who did that? And why are we going to put this punishment over? Because what we believe is that's going to deter future behaviours occurring. Now, it'd be fair to say that I think this is where we get most frustrated with this model when we see our frequent flyers, continual behaviours that are presented, students doing the same thing they did yesterday despite the consequence. And they'll accept that consequence because that's the model they know. Under a restorative framework or a restorative approach, what we know is that the focus is on the past, into the present, and then, importantly, to the future. That what we're talking about here is an emphasis on resulting harm. You'll notice that word harm will start to pop up a little bit over the course of the next half hour. And really, it's a key part of what we're talking about when we talk about a restorative approach. And that's how we measure the damage that may be done by the harm that's being caused. And that's when it's okay to put the consequences in place. And the third part is that we know is that the deterrence of the behaviour is linked to personal accountability and the relationships that are formed. So I don't want to behave in that way because of the people that I'm going to affect. And when we can build the capacity of our young people, the people within our school, to understand that their behaviour is having an impact on others, that's when we're going to get a greater success, and that's when we're going to make our days most enjoyable. So ultimately, what I'm asking for here is can we give our kids the tools to fix their own problems? Wouldn't that be a nice day when we get to the point where those words, I'm sorry, have a little bit more meaning to them? And when we get to the point that we're actually showing that we're sorry, that what we're doing is we're getting our kids to buy in to solutions. Now, it's not just that I'm doing to you, it's actually about doing with. And we're going to pick up on that word with a little bit later on. We're doing education with our kids. But ultimately, this is the underlying direction that we want to take our school community when we talk about a restorative approach. Now, I guess, what is the methodology, or what is the practice that we talk about? And when I talk about, again, some of those filters that people have, or some of the previous exposures that people will maybe have been, one, upskilled, or two, through professional learning opportunities, it's more than just circles. And I think that's a really important thing. I often talk to educators and say, oh, what is this restorative practice stuff? Oh, yeah, I know about that. It's about circles. Yeah, well, it is about circles, but it's about a lot more than just circles. For us, there are 4 key parts that we cover. The first one is around a restorative framework. And the restorative framework is around the continuing operating domains. Have we got a way that we can reflect, a quick way to be able to give us some feedback on our practice? We'll touch on that a little bit later on. Second one is around a fair process, the importance of a fair process, and there are 3 E's that make up a fair process, and we'll get into that as the webinar unfolds. And then we've got our restorative questions. Now, I think it's really important here. I'm just going to touch on the restorative questions. People may have seen the restorative questions. And when I talk about the restorative questions, what I'm talking about are questions like, what happened? What were you thinking about at the time? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you've done? And the questions go on. There are 5 questions. What's important to note is that the questions are just a guide. They are not a script. If you see something occur in your classroom, if the behaviour that is presented to you is certainly right under your nose and you know exactly what happened, you don't need to go through a blow by blow, question by question to get through to that past, present, future. You can just get quite informal about it. We're going to talk about that informal approach very shortly. But really, it can be as simple as, what's going on there? It doesn't have to be that formal questioning where you pull your question card out of your lanyard, you hold them in front of your student, and you work through in a 1, 2, 3 step process. It can be quite an informal approach. And really, the importance of the questions are to go from past to present and then into future. Now, the last part of this is around the theory and the research. This isn't just a great idea. It's that adversarial to blame, and there is theory and research that backs it up. And again, what we'll do is we've started to touch on that a little bit today. We are going to be a little bit time poor in this webinar, so I will sort of move through things pretty quick. But at any stage post the webinar or two in future webinars, you'll see a number of webinars that we've got popping up. It's important to be able to go, oh yeah, this is sort of about the area that Simon was talking about. Maybe this is of a bit of interest to me. Or you can just reach out. You know what, Simon? I need a little bit more on that restorative, the work behind it. Can you give me some insight to that? And that certainly, that offers there as well. So that's the practice that we cover. That's how it informs the work that we actually do, and that underpins the way that we actually behave, the way that we practice across our school. Now, what I sort of, again, I've touched on this earlier, that we use that word informal. And I think it's important to note that in the work that we do, our restorative practices, it sits on a continuum. That continuum is a really informal to quite a formal end. And this is the part, I guess, about it that I love the most. When we're talking down at that informal end, what I'm talking about at the informal end are behaviours or situations or interactions that are of high frequency and of low severity in terms of behaviour, and they cost us very little time in terms of dealing with them. So you'll actually see the 5 points across the continuum are different approaches to managing behaviours, to managing challenges, to managing the interactions that you have across your schoolyard that range from a very informal approach, high frequency, low severity, right through to the formal approach, which is the high severity, low frequency. And when I talk at the formal end, what I'm talking about there is that when harm is at its greatest. I'm just going to talk you through each of the 5 different steps along that continuum. Number 1 is the effective statement. Now, when I'm talking about effective statement, what I want you to think about is, how many informal interactions do you have every day across the school? I would say that when I speak to most educators, they'd probably give me something up around 200 informal interactions. If I was to really get that and say, what is it that I'm talking about when I'm talking about informal interactions? I'm talking about the opportunities that we have in the yard, that we have in the classroom, that we have as they're leaving school. And we see things that we go, I just need to remind the student of what the right thing to do is there. Now, when I'm talking about the effective statements, what I'm talking about is throwing in a feelings word. Making sure that we are telling the students on a continual basis how we feel about their behaviour. Now, the default position for me, and I'm going to give you an example that we often use, the default position for me would have previously been, if I was walking through the yard and I see a student drop a piece of paper on the ground, I would have said, could you please pick that piece of paper up? It's quite respectful, asking the student to do something, nothing wrong with that. If I now say, I'm going to take a step back from that, I'm going to throw in an effective word that's going to help me explain to the student how I felt about that behaviour, and it will be as simple as, it disappoints me to see you drop that piece of paper. Could you please pick it up and put it in the bin? Now, I'm sure that the word that you could hear in that second take would have been disappoints. So what I've done is I've made a little deposit into the care and understanding tank of the student who I've just had an interaction with. Now, if I do that multiple times per day, and I know how much our teachers love and care for our students, what I'm actually doing them is I'm giving them a little bit more insight to how I feel about their behaviour. Now, it's important to note, I've got to be totally honest with you right here. If I was to go and throw that around a yard today, don't expect every student to respond in 100% compliance and never again behave in a way that we go, that's against what I want, or that's against what we agreed on. What actually happens is it increases the chances of success. Cost me nothing, cost me about 2 seconds. So if we're throwing those effective statements across our school multiple times a day, what we're actually doing is building the care and understanding for our young people, and we're showing them this behaviour affects someone else. Now, if that doesn't get the result that we want, and I'm going to say the return on investment is going to be quite high. If this is a starting point that you're looking for, right here is that point now. An effective interaction is where we sort of move down. An effective interaction is a quick one-on-one interaction that we have on a low-level issue. So really, it's about taking from the past to the present and then into the future. The effective interactions can be simple. They can be something that's been able to be undertaken in the classroom. It might be an informal, hey, I just need to stay back at the end of this class and just have a really quick chat. Or it might be something that occurs in the yard when you see a student. Just do something that, again, it's low level, low severity, and you don't want to invest massive time in it. So the effective interaction, again, can be quite an informal approach. It's a really easy way of just taking from the past. What we're talking about here is saying who's affected and why, and what are we going to do to fix this mess up? So effectively, you're co-designing. As I move along the impromptu conference, I've got to sort of, this brings back some great memories for me, the impromptu conference. They're the typical social issues that we face in our school environment. For me, the impromptu conference generally felt like the way that I worked in and around restorative practices. It felt like I was sort of launching the educational CSI. It felt like what I was sort of doing was wasting hours and hours of my time as we went around and around circles, and I was digging up all sorts of stuff. So what we've got, and this hits on that myth that I talked about around time wasting. The impromptu conference is a way of going past, present, future, timely, and what we want to do for this situation is really focus on setting up, 1, what happened, 2, who's been affected and why, and 3, how are we actually going to fix this? And the method that we use is what we call P3, P3, Now, there might be a later opportunity for me to come back and revisit that, but really it's about spending the time equally across what happened, getting a snapshot of what happened, how are we going to fix this problem, and that's the important, I guess, that who's been affected and why, and then how are we going to fix that as we move forward. The important part here is I think that as the leader or as the teacher or as the person, the adult involved in this, I think it's important for you to be part of that who's been affected, because you've been affected. It's been time out of your day. It's been an inconvenience for you. Often they're quite stressful situations that we're in those social issues. And the third part of that is that if you can be part of the solution. Now, the important thing here is that we can't have the solution being, I need her to do this, I need him to do that. It's about, I will. It's not about other people. It's what you're going to do to commit to the group. And often I say in this part is that I will make sure that I follow up with this group in a week's time and see how we're all going. Now, the important thing here is that I've invested a little bit more time. And the reason I've invested a bit more time is because what I'm finding is that I now need to formalise some of this work that we're doing, because this isn't a low-level issue anymore. This is sort of getting to that medium level. As I keep going along the continuum, I'm just going to quickly brush over the large group stuff, because really that's the circles. And my next slide will give a better outline of the circles. So I'll come back to that. The last part of that continuum, as you can see there, is the formal conference. Now, I think what's important about the formal conference is that we are talking about severe harm that's caused. And this might be when it's okay to say, right, suspensions need to be put into place, because what I need is some time to be able to prepare for this conference. And that conference needs to be really formal. It needs to be really structured. And this is where the questions have a real meaning. This is where the questions have a real purpose. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail today, but what I'm going to say is that across the school year, we want to have a minimal number of formal conferences, and generally they are something that the leaders of the school need to be upskilled in. So there will be a later stage. We've got some other webinars that focus around that. But again, we're talking about high severity, low frequency, and we're talking about massive time investment there. So that's that formal end. I'm going to step you back to that large group, because I want to talk about the circles for about the next 5 or 6 minutes. And I think, the importance of the circles, and for me, before I get to that, I want to sort of clarify these approaches are a combination of both proactive and reactive strategies. So we're actually doing some of this work in preparation for offsetting behaviours that we don't want to see across our school, but we're also reacting to some of the behaviours that we have seen, and we're actually mopping up some of those the messes that may have been caused. So really, when we talk about what the circles are that we use 5 circles as a starting point that are a really simple way of being able to check in with our students, check out with our students. I'm going to talk about those 2 quickly. The check-in, as you can see, it's focused on the present. The check-out focused on the past. The frequency for both of these circles, we're going to say minimum once per week. For a check-in, it's a great thing to do on a Monday morning. Check-out, great thing to do on a Friday afternoon. Can I just say that the check-in circles, the approach of the check-in circles, there's some learning that can take out of this right now and apply it to some of those challenges that you'll be facing on a daily basis. Checking in with your students to see how they're actually going. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to be in that true circle format, but it is about how they're actually doing, how they're feeling, and how they want to feel. So what we can do is we can start to use some of the principles of the check-in right now in that home learning or distant learning environment that we're all facing as we speak. The first thing about the check-in and the check-out is they're quite structured, quite formal. As we move into the next 3, the preparation, the response, and the learning, what's important to note is that they've got to serve your learning purpose. There's some principles there that we can unpack over time, but I think the important thing about the preparation, response, and learning is that the frequency is when you need them. And when we're getting to the point where our circles are actually informing our practice, that's when, for me, we know this is going to have the biggest impact. And I'm going to jump to that learning circle and quickly talk about that for a couple of minutes. The importance of the learning circle is allowing us to be able to introduce new content. It's to be able to get a bit of feedback on what we've been learning about. It certainly allows us to be able to check in on the learning or the task or the activity that we've just been able to be doing there. And it's a good way of being able to chunk down instruction. I use that word chunk down quite explicitly because all of our circles allow us to be able to chunk down instruction in a way that we can provide clarity, meaning, we can provide explanation, and then we can get our students to go back to the group. Now, I think the important thing when we talk about that chunking down of instruction, quite often what we do is we sort of feel like in our normal classroom environment, what we want to do is go, right, I need to get this information out, I need to get our students on task. And what we have is we've got a whole range of different behaviours that sort of present. We have our students that are a little bit fidgety, we have our students that get distracted, we have our students that just can go and get on task, and quite often they disengage in the conversations that we're having when we're sitting in our seats, because what they do is that they feel that they just want to get that task completed. So the beauty of circling up, the beauty of getting our students to move from the tables, from their learning spaces to a circle, is that one, it provides those little, and it's a word that we're quite often using now, is those little brain breaks, gets them to a different environment within the classroom. It also takes out that element of power or authority that as teachers, the architecture of our classroom often dictates that we are in a position of authority. So it's about doing learning with our students, where we're actually part of the circle, where we are part of the solution, and we're also part of the problem. So the important thing about circles is the natural environment of a circle takes away the power that we often have when we're standing in front of a class and we're doing to our students. I'm going to talk about, I've used that word to our students and with our students a little bit. So 5 easy ways to get started with classroom circles. There will be some later webinars to follow, and I think it's in a couple of weeks. Going to be doing a webinar there on response circles, and that response circle is going to be specifically focused on how am I preparing my students for a return to the classroom environment post the mess and the stress and the challenge that we're going through at the moment. So if you want to find out a little bit more about the circles, and in particular the response circles and how that can be used, then certainly look out for that webinar at a later stage. I guess the other really important thing, and if I'm going to sort of put my black hat on here, I've got the critic sitting in the back of my mind thinking, oh yeah, it's okay for you, but what happens if a kid doesn't join the circle? Or what about if they come to the circle and they don't participate? Well, I'm going to say 2 things. Number 1 is that type of behaviour is probably going to present anyway. So what we're doing is we're increasing our chances. Number 2 is there are a number of little strategies and hacks as we get into this work that will help us better prepare for getting that engagement to happen. And I've seen it happen, and I'd have to say, hand on heart, excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink. Hand on heart, I've actually had some success, and multiple times have we seen students not engage in a circle and then want to come to the circle because it's a safe place for learning. It takes away power and it breaks down authority. So there is a really clear direction that we can take when those challenges present. But they do happen. It's a normal thing where students resist something new, and I get that. So I've got to really call on this bottom comment here and say, this is why it's so important for me. It's restorative practice for a reason. So make sure you get out there and have a practice. All right, I'm going at you pretty quick here. I'm very mindful of that. What I want to do is probably just shift now into a part of, I guess, me that sort of makes all of this stand to truth in terms of the classroom, the stuff that I believe, and what I'm going to talk to you about, what I think are the key components, whether you want to call them big wins, or given the limited time that we've got together, the 5 takeaways that I want you to sort of hold on to in terms of future conversations that you may be able to have and future directions that may be worth looking at as we go into the... Sorry, I've just got a question pop up there. Ange, I might jump into your question there. Good to have you on, Ange. Thank you. Any insights, experience with RP? Yeah, good. Look, I really appreciate that question, Ange. I think the important thing here, and I'm going to go right back to that culture slide. When we talk about culture, what we're talking about is not just about our students. And I think this whole work needs to be centered around the fact that we have got 3 key stakeholders in our school. We've actually got our students, we've got our teachers, and we've got our parents. The important thing to note here is that a lot of the language that we use, and I'm going to say this is the starting point, this is 101. The important thing about this is so useful, so effective for our staff as well. And it's the way that our adults treat each other across the school, because as we know, the way that our adults interact, the way that our teachers interact, the way that they model the behaviours, that actually sets up for what our students get to see. So this restorative approach can be really effective for the work that we do with our teachers as well. Hope I've sort of touched on that in the right way for you, Angie. If not, just say more info, please, Simon, or maybe we could connect a little bit later on. Good to see you still listening in too. I appreciate that. All right. As I said, big 5 takeaways. Make the most of the informal. I've got to stress the importance of this for me. Let's say in any given day, and I've mentioned this number before, 200 informal interactions across our school. Multiply that out. If we had 50 staff members sitting in our school, that's 10,000. Multiply that by the 5 days, multiply that by the 10 weeks, multiply that by the 4 times a year. We're up in the millions of informal interactions that we have with our young people every year. So many opportunities for us to build that relationship with them, and so many opportunities for us to be able to offset escalation of behaviours. So what I want to do is go maximise the informal, make the most of them. If we can offset behaviours escalating, if we can offset challenges escalating, then for me, that's a great return on an investment. Not only that, don't we get a better relationship with our kids when we get to know who they are and what they stand for? So get those informal opportunities, maximise them. It's about the language when we talk about this stuff. Number 2, it takes us out of the past. And again, probably as a print, spending time in a secondary setting, the amount of hours that I would have wasted in the past working on situations that, it's like the metaphor of you pull the piece of string from the jumper and the whole jumper comes out. What would happen is I would get anchored in the past, and we often use it as that reference to educational CSI. Have you ever launched educational CSI in your school and you start digging up, and all of a sudden you start bringing up stuff that, happened last week, last year, the sister of, the brother of, and you go, where did this mess start and now where's it actually going to end? The beauty of restorative practices allows me to go from the past to the present and into the future. And really it's that future that I'm caring about. Number 3, consequences. And I think, this is, again, when I talk to schools, this is one of our greatest challenges that we face. I often like to switch that word consequences to outcomes and use the word outcomes. And, I talked again about it with this to a teacher the other day. Consequences don't have to be negative, but often we've sort of set them up in a negative way. Really, when we're talking about consequences, what we're talking about is not necessarily the behaviour, but we're talking about the harm that has been caused. And when harm's severe, then it's okay to have a consequence in place. And again, I sort of got to come back to this. If we can get to, and I'll get to this in a second, if we can get to a point where we have our students involved in this, our parents involved, they're more likely to, I guess, accept what those consequences or outcome might be. Now, so for me, there are generally 3 reasons why we would use a consequence or an outcome. Number 1 is when harm is so severe. And people often say to me, what do you mean by severe harm? I just reckon it's enough when you see a behaviour and you go, you know what, that didn't quite make me feel right. And I got that little knot in my stomach, or the harm there that was caused has made me feel a little bit upset by that. And I think that's number 1 in terms of when we can actually use the consequences. Number 2, when they're agreed in advance, and when, this is the most successful when we can co-design. So we see a behaviour, and I guess I sort of talk to the frequent flyers here. When we see a behaviour that occurs and we often see that repeat behaviour, I think it's okay then at that point that we're setting up for clarity for the next time that behaviour occurs to say to the student, if this happens again, can we agree that? Get them to write it on a piece of paper, get them to sign it, put it in your desk drawer and hold on to it. As they walk out of the room, I guarantee that you'll be there going, I bet you I'm going to pull that piece of paper out again. So when that behaviour does present again, then we've got that agreed consequence or that agreed outcome in place. What happens is it depersonalises it and it takes us away from the teacher and putting it onto the student, but actually saying you're responsible for this. My job is just to hold you accountable. High support, high accountability. The third one is when the student may have chosen it. An example of this, I guess, is that, if we're going to sort of work through that restorative discussion, if we're going to go past, present, future, and what we get is kids that just check out. And they check out because they go, you know what? I'm not saying anything here. I'm not answering your stupid questions, all of those sort of things. I think it's okay at that point to go, right, either one, I reckon we can mop this mess up. And again, be a little bit informal about it. We can mop this mess up in 15 minutes. All I just want to talk about is who's been affected and why. The second thing around that is if we choose not to go down that path, then this is going to be the case. A couple of lunchtime detentions are going to ring home. What will happen, and in particular early days of implementing this sort of work, most kids will choose I'll take the cutlet detentions and ring my parents. Why? Because it's a model that they're familiar with. What they know is that it's clearly defined what's going to happen for them. They're familiar with it and they'll move on from it. What we want them to get to the point of doing is being able to say, these are the people that have been affected by my impacted by my behaviour, and this is what I'm going to do to fix it up. Because we're shifting to that type of direction, it actually might take some kids a little bit longer to come on board. And again, I just sort of threw, really? You're going to take that option of the detentions? You're going to take that option of the phone call home? That's cool. That's your choice. I reckon we could have mixed this up. And again, the stronger the relationships we build with our kids, the more likely they are to do that. Because I go back to that slide around, wouldn't we want our kids fixing their own problems? Wouldn't it be nice if we got kids feeling like they didn't want to affect and they didn't want to hurt and they didn't want to take learning opportunities away from other students? And ultimately, that's what we're aiming to achieve here. Number 4, that's not fair. And, this is my poster child for the that's not fair, because I think for me, it's that common word that we hear far too often. Fairness. And when we talk about fairness, what we want to do is stand behind a model that has a fair process. And that fair process will be adhered to at all times. What it actually means is that we're not always going to get exactly the same outcome or exactly the same consequence, but you will get a fair process. Now, when I'm talking about a fair process, there are 3 things that make up a fair process. Number 1, we're going to ensure that we've got the engagement. If you go back to that slide where I had the circles, there was the 3 E's. The 3 E's that make up a fair process. Number 1 is engagement. Engage the people who have been affected, or engage the people who have been impacted by this. What I'm going to say here is go to the person who's caused the harm first. Get their insight, because what will happen is they're normally the person who's going to check out first. So I'd say to you, stop, go to that person, then come to the victim or the person who's been on the receiving end at a little bit later stage. Number 2 is explanation. Explain what has actually happened and explain to everyone involved what has actually happened. This is where we can get our parents involved in the process. And number 3, and I think for me, this is sort of like the big one, expectation clarity. So if we see that behaviour again, what's actually going to happen? So setting new directions, setting new expectations. And again, a lot of our work is around high support and high accountability. So all we need to do is, once we set those expectations, is make sure that we follow them through. And if a student behaves in a certain way, if we see something occur, then what our job is to do is to ensure that accountability sits there. And again, if we have that fair process in place, what we'll find is that students will be more likely to accept the outcome. And just as important, our parents are more likely to accept the outcome. we're going to hear less of the "that's not fair." And the last thing in terms of a takeaway, reflection. I think schools are doing an exceptionally good job now of reflecting on practice. I think teachers have taken some massive steps over the last few years. We've got, I guess, a whole range of peer observations happening. We've got some really great stuff in terms of supporting each other's, one, practice, but two, reflecting on our own practice. But when we talk about reflection, if I was to go to a staff and say, have we got a common model that we reflect on regularly, numerous times throughout a day? Most staff would tell me, no, we do it in our own sort of way, in our own sort of time, and not that regular, once a week, once a fortnight, once a term. What I'm going to say is that under a restorative model, what we know is that we can use the operating domains as a way of reflecting on our current practice. And we're not going to get a huge amount of time to dig into this today, but just to give you a really quick overview of the operating domains, think about the teacher that you respect the most. Think about a teacher that you look down the hallway and you go, they are an absolute superstar. That person is a gun. You might even be thinking about your own practice. And if that's the case, good on you. Think about your time back in the school. Now, I would say that our best teachers are a nice combination of firmness and fairness. And anyone that's seen these quadrant models before, what you know is you want to be in the far right model. So when we talk about high firmness and high fairness, that means that sometimes we might not get the balance right. And if we don't get the balance right and we're high on firm, what we are is we're doing to our students. So we're a little bit punitive. Today, I've been high on the firm and low on the fair because I guess my approach today has been around doing to you, talking at you for an hour. And again, I know that if this is in the classroom, if I was working with a group of teachers, this would not serve me. The box where I'm low on the firm and I'm low on the fair, I'm not doing much at all. And as you can see there, some of those words that explain what our not box actually looks like. Moving across, when we're high on the fair and low on the firm, what we're doing is we're doing for our students. And this is the typical situation where that student that just loves to drag down the expectations, drags down that bar and go, it's just too hard. Well, it's okay, I'll do it for you. So when we're doing the for, we're a little bit easier, a little bit undemanding. And the last one, which is where we want to be, which is the firm and the fair, is when we're doing with the students. Now, when we're doing with the students, we're authoritative, we're relational, we're respectful. I think the important difference there between the two and the with box, that authoritarian, authoritative is when we go through our practice. And authoritarian is when we're doing to or doing at the students. So what we want to do is use our power through our practice. And it's not about giving up our right as a teacher. It's not about giving up our responsibilities. It's actually about being respectful and bringing our students closer to us based on the relationship that we have with them. So for me, it's at any stage throughout a day, throughout a week, throughout a year, you will move through multiple boxes. But what I want you to do is think about, what's your practice been like? Have I been doing with my students, or have I been doing something along the lines of to, not, and for? And if you have, can I pinch a point? Can I pinch a little bit of practice and go, I'm going to move that into the with box? And it's as simple as that. So it gives us a really simple way of reflecting on our practice that tells us where we're at in terms of the relationships that we have and the practice within our classroom. All right, so we've just about finished up. I just want to sort of close on a and for the last 50 minutes, I've just gone at you with a whole heap of information. And in some ways, I do apologise. In another way, I want to say, if you want more information, because you go, there's a couple of things that just triggered some thinking, triggered a few questions. My email is on the slide there. I want you to grab that email and go, I'm going to send Simon an email with my questions, with my complaints, with my concerns. It's open to do that. Other thing is, mobile phone numbers there as well. So feel free to reach out if you want to talk this stuff through. It is a slow burn. It's not something that if you put into place tomorrow, you're going to start to see the success before the end of the week. It is certainly something in terms of what does it stand for. And I don't think there are many teachers that I'm going to go, oh, relationships aren't important in schools. But I'm going to say we need to get explicit about these relationships. We need to get really clear on what a solid, effective, high leverage relationship looks like, and how do we actually impact that? Well, what's our underarching or overarching work that we're going to do around it, and what's our practice look like? Before I leave you, I just want to close off by saying thank you for the work that you're doing. Again, I come back to where I started. I say, in what is probably the most testing of times that Our school teachers, our students are doing an amazing job. I want to say thank you for taking the 50 minutes out of your day to be able to go, I'm going to put some time aside and just hear, take a distraction, listen to, try and find out a little bit more. I really appreciate that. I certainly hope that you have a great finish to today, and I wish you all the best in the challenges that present. And please get on board for some of our upcoming webinars. We'd love to have you there and sharing some of the great work that we're doing, but more importantly, sharing some of the great things that you're doing in your schools. All right, take care. Thank you.